On the night of the 6th of June, 1969, two battalions of North Vietnamese infantry crawled through the dark toward a fire base in Tay Ninh province. They had counted the Americans: one rifle company, one artillery battery. 150 men, maybe fewer, dug into a patch of red dirt 8 miles from the Cambodian border. The North Vietnamese had brought a regiment. They had done the math on the men in the trenches. They had not done the math on the thing circling 3,000 feet above them. It was an old transport plane, a relic from the Second World War, and it carried 3 electric miniguns that could throw 18,000 rounds a minute, a solid rope of fire that fell out of the black sky like water. The men on the ground called it Puff. The men who flew it called it Spooky. The enemy just called it the Dragon. By first light, 323 of them were dead in the wire. Not one American had been killed. This is how the Dragon earned its name. Vietnam had a rule that everyone who fought there learned fast. The day belonged to the Americans. The night belonged to the other side. After dark, the jungle swallowed everything. Fast jets screamed over at 400 knots and saw nothing. No targets, no muzzle flashes, just black canopy and the occasional stitch of tracer. By the time a pilot found the fight, he was already past it. A fire base under attack at 2 in the morning was, for the most part, on its own. The North Vietnamese built their entire way of war around that fact. They came in the dark. A barrage of rockets and mortars first to keep heads down. Then sappers, engineers with satchel charges and Bangalore torpedoes worming through the wire to blow gaps. Then the infantry, in waves, straight into the gaps. At 2:55 on the morning of the 6th of June, that doctrine arrived at Firebase Crook. The first rockets came out of the northwest, 107 and 122 millimeter, screaming in over the trees. Most of them overshot. But one mortar round found a bunker, and a young American died in the opening seconds, the only man the garrison would lose in 3 nights of fighting. Then the sappers hit the wire. 16 of them, Bangalore's in hand, crawling under the concertina on the southwest side. The men in the trenches were outnumbered, in the dark, exactly where the enemy wanted them. And that would have been the whole story, except for what was circling, silent, in the clouds above. To understand how 150 men killed a regiment, you have to understand the Dragon. The idea was almost 40 years old, and nobody had ever made it work. Fire a machine gun sideways out of a banking airplane, and if you fly a tight enough circle, every round lands on the same spot on the ground. In 1964, an Air Force captain named Ronald Terry finally proved it. He bolted 3 electric Gatling guns into the side of a C-47, a Douglas Skytrain, the same tired workhorse that had hauled paratroopers over Normandy 20 years earlier, pointed them out the left-hand windows and door, and took 2 of them to Bien Hoa. Here is why it worked. It wasn't marksmanship. It was geometry. The pilot rolled into a slow left bank and held a single point on the ground pinned between his propeller hub and the engine cowling. As long as he held that turn, the 3 guns stayed locked on that one patch of earth, pouring fire into it for as long as the ammunition lasted. A jet got 1 pass. The Dragon got all night. And the guns. 3 miniguns, 7.62 millimeter, each one spinning up to 6,000 rounds a minute. 18,000 combined at the maximum, though the gunners fired in short, disciplined bursts, because at that rate a full load lasted only seconds. Every 5th round was a tracer. Think about that. 1 round you can see for every 4 you can't. And even then, the stream looked solid, a single unbroken cord of fire falling from the clouds. A 3-second burst could put a bullet into every square yard of a target the size of a football field. The first man to watch it hunt at night gave it its name. In the spring of 1965, over a Delta village, a reporter watching those tracers described it as dragon's breath. The squadron commander laughed and called it Puff, the Magic Dragon, after the song that was on every radio that year. The name stuck. The song had nothing to do with it. The men on the ground didn't care, because the first time one of these aircraft answered a call, in December of 1964, it reached a surrounded Special Forces camp 37 minutes after the radio call, fired 4,500 rounds into the tree line, and broke the assault before it touched the wire. And the men who flew it paid for every mission. 3 months before Crook, on the 24th of February 1969, a Spooky was orbiting over Long Bin when an enemy mortar round struck the right wing and detonated inside the cargo compartment. It tore a hole 2 feet across and punched more than 3,000 fragments through the fuselage. Everyone in the back was hit. A 23-year-old loadmaster, Airman First Class John Levito, took 40 pieces of shrapnel in his back and legs. And then he saw it, a live magnesium flare, already triggered, rolling loose across a floor stacked with cans holding 19,000 rounds of ammunition. If it caught, the aircraft was gone. Levito threw himself on it, dragged it the length of the compartment, hurled it out the door. It ignited as it fell clear. He became the first enlisted airman in Air Force history to receive the Medal of Honor. That was the machine the North Vietnamese did not account for at Firebase Crook. Crook was not an accident. It was bait. By the summer of 1969, the 25th Infantry Division had learned to build small bases directly on the enemy's infiltration routes, deliberately isolated, deliberately tempting, and then wire them for killing. Crook sat 8 miles northwest of Tay Ninh City, straddling a trail the North Vietnamese used to move men from Cambodia into War Zone C. The garrison cut 2 great circles into the brush around the perimeter, at 150 meters and 300, and pre-registered every gun on them. Seismic sensors were buried in the approaches. Ground radar swept the tree lines. The enemy thought they were sneaking up on 150 tired men. In fact, the base had been listening to them for hours. "The real key to our success was early warning," said Major Joseph Hacia, executive officer of the 3rd Battalion 22nd Infantry, who ran the fight from the ground. "The base's sensors," he said, "had the enemy pinpointed hours before they ever reached the perimeter. So when the sappers hit the southwest wire at 2:55 that first morning, the men in the bunkers were already awake, already aimed. Specialist Thomas Bellin of Bravo Company saw them first, shapes crawling under the concertina. He opened up with his machine gun and did not stop, burning the barrel until it glowed. Sergeant First Class Donald Neal grabbed 2 grenade launchers and a fistful of bandoliers and threw himself in beside him. The 16 sappers never made it through. Then the howitzers opened up. Battery A, 7th Battalion, 11th Artillery, under Captain Richard Neal, was not firing over the enemy. It was firing at them, barrels level, point blank, a technique the gunners called Killer Junior. Shells fused to burst 30 feet up and rain steel down on troops caught in the open. At 100 meters, a 105 howitzer firing level is not artillery anymore. It's a shotgun the size of a car. And then, around 4 in the morning, the sky opened. 15 enemy heavy machine guns, 51 caliber, the North Vietnamese anti-aircraft weapon, opened up from the tree line, hosing tracer into the dark. They were shooting at the Dragon. They knew it was up there, and it didn't matter. Puff rolled into its bank, pinned the muzzle flashes under its guns, and answered. The men on the ground had never heard anything like it. Not the crack of a rifle, not the thump of a mortar. A single, tearing, mechanical roar, a buzzsaw the size of the sky, and under it, that rope of red fire pouring straight down, joining the clouds to the earth. By 5:30, the enemy had pulled back into the jungle. First light brought the sweep. 76 bodies in the wire, 15 weapons, and 1 American dead, the man from the opening barrage, killed before the Dragon ever fired a shot. The fight didn't stay inside the wire. At dawn, Alpha Company was lifted by helicopter 4 kilometers north to cut off the retreat. Following a strand of enemy communication wire through the brush, 1st Lieutenant William Irvin's men walked straight into the North Vietnamese regimental headquarters. They called airstrikes onto it and fought until the light failed, and they were forced back. The regiment that attacked Crook was now bleeding from both ends. That was the first night. The North Vietnamese came back for the second. They were the 9th Division, the 272nd, and the 88th Regiments, veteran formations that had fought the Americans at Junction City 2 years before. They had spent 76 men taking the measure of the base. Now they thought they knew where the wire was thin. They massed 2 battalions for a coordinated assault from the northeast and the northwest, and they came in strength. By one account, more than 400 men in the assault waves alone. They still had to cross the open ground. The sensors caught them again. At 2 in the morning on the 7th of June, a searchlight helicopter the men called Nighthawk swept the road east of the base and found them moving up it in columns. The artillery walked onto them before they had even formed for the attack. Then, at 3, the full weight of it came out of the dark, and everything the base had was waiting. The howitzers fired level into the northwest wire. The mortars dropped on the assembly areas. Cobra gunships worked the 51 calibers to the west, and above all of it, orbiting under the burning white light of magnesium flares, the Dragon and its cousin, an AC-119 gunship, call sign Shadow, hunted the 2 battalions in the open. Coordinating every aircraft in that crowded sky was an Air Force forward air controller, Major John Bode. For 3 nights he flew low over the battle, under a 1,000-foot ceiling, day and night, stacking gunships and fighters and artillery so that none of them hit the base, or each other. He flew 6 missions and more than 17 hours in the middle of it. He would receive the Air Force Cross. On the ground, Specialist Richard Marroquin held the northeast corner behind an M60 machine gun as the assault came straight at his position. 12 enemy soldiers went down in front of him. When it was over, he could only describe the sky. This place, he said, was lit up like the 4th of July. The Northwest Battalion breached the outer wire. It got no further. The Northeast assault was stopped short of the concertina, and then the geometry of the trap closed. The attackers were caught in the open, between the wire and the tree line, with nowhere to go, and the dragon simply held its turn, pouring fire into the ground where they lay for as long as they stayed there. Most of them never made it back to the jungle. When the sun came up on the 7th of June, the men of Bravo Company walked out into the killing ground and counted. 323 dead, 10 prisoners, more than 40 weapons left in the dirt. Inside the wire, 3 Americans had been wounded. None had been killed. "We had one hell of a battle on our hands," said Lieutenant Colonel Robert Carmichael, the battalion commander. His men, he said, had pushed back 2 regiments in 2 nights. There was a 3rd night. It barely qualified as a fight, a little small arms fire, a few mortars, a probe that the artillery and the gunships broke up in a couple of hours. The division history called it a parting gesture from a beaten regiment. By then, the 272nd had had enough of Firebase Crook. The North Vietnamese had a name for the aircraft, and they had a rule about it. They called it the Dragon, the same word the South Vietnamese used, the word that had crossed the lines. And in captured documents, their commanders had left instructions for what to do when it appeared overhead. "Do not fire on it. You can't bring it down with a rifle," the order reasoned, "and shooting only tells it where you are. You will not kill the dragon. You will only make it angry." Think about what that means. An army that had learned to own the night, that had built its whole doctrine around the dark, wrote it into orders that when this one aircraft arrived, the correct response was to stop shooting and pray it didn't see you. That is what fear looks like on paper. But the Dragon was not invincible, and the men who flew it knew that better than anyone. It was old, and it was slow. A 1930s airliner lumbering in a predictable circle at 3,000 feet, unarmored, holding still just long enough for every gun on the ground to range it. Those 1551 calibers at Crook were trying to do exactly that. It survived because other aircraft killed the guns hunting it, not because it couldn't be hit. Across the war, the Air Force lost around a dozen of them in combat, and it was already being replaced by the faster AC-119 and then by the AC-130, a gunship that carried cannon and, in the end, a full 105 howitzer in its side. The old Skytrains were handed down to the South Vietnamese and the Laotians, but at Crook, in June of 1969, the Dragon was exactly enough. The men in the trenches never forgot the sound, not the miniguns, the drone, the heavy, patient drone of old propellers turning in a slow circle overhead. To the enemy, it was the sound of the monster arriving. To the Americans in the wire, it was the opposite. It meant they weren't alone in the dark. It meant the perimeter would hold until morning. The gunship is still up there tonight. The Skytrain is long retired, but the idea Ronald Terry proved over Bien Hoa lives on in the AC-130, and the call sign endures. The men who fly the modern ones still answer to Spooky. Firebase Crook is farmland now. The circles cut into the brush grew over decades ago. 323 men died in the open ground there in a single night, and 1 American died in the wire, and the difference between those 2 numbers was not courage. Both sides had that. The difference was that one side looked up, and the other side never thought to. They counted the men in the trenches. They forgot to count the Dragon. If you like this one, YouTube reckons you're going to like the video on your screen right now.